The morning of September 12, 1683, held the fate of a continent in its hands. This is the story of the Siege of Vienna, a desperate last stand that stopped an empire in its tracks. By the end, you will understand the true scale of a legendary cavalry charge and why its echo still shapes our world today. We will uncover the critical mistakes made within the Ottoman command tent and witness the fragile alliance that formed just in time. How much of our present world rests on the decisions of a single, dusty afternoon? To understand the panic in Vienna, we must first look east. By the 1680s, the Ottoman Empire was not merely a regional power, it was a colossus. Its territories stretched from the gates of Vienna all the way to the Persian Gulf and across North Africa. This was an empire at the peak of its territorial reach, governed from the dazzling capital of Constantinople. And at its head was not the Sultan, but a man of singular ambition, the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was a veteran commander, but also a figure driven by a profound desire for personal glory. For him, the capture of Vienna would be the ultimate prize, a conquest to eclipse all others and secure his name in history forever. The machinery of this empire was now pointed directly at the heart of Europe. The Europe that awaited this force was a picture of division. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of hundreds of princely states, cities, and bishoprics, was still recovering from the devastating 30 Years' War, a conflict that had ended just a generation earlier and left the German lands exhausted and depopulated. These states were often more focused on their own rivalries and religious squabbles than on presenting a united front. To the Ottomans, this internal strife was not a secret, it was an invitation. They saw a continent weakened by its own conflicts, a door that was already slightly ajar. This is why Vienna was so much more than just another city on a map. Geographically, it was the great bulwark on the Danube River, the last major fortified barrier before the open plains of Germany and beyond. But symbolically, its importance was even greater. Vienna was the eastern capital of the Holy Roman Empire. If it fell, it would not just be a military loss, it would be a catastrophic blow to the morale and unity of all Christendom. It would signal that the Ottoman advance was unstoppable. Contemporary letters and diplomatic reports from the time are filled with a palpable dread. One ambassador wrote of the, quote, Turkish menace, unquote, as a shadow creeping across the continent, a fear that was both military and deeply cultural. The stage was set not just for a battle, but for a clash of civilizations. All the tension in the air that summer gathered along the banks of the Danube, where the fate of a city and perhaps a continent would soon be decided. Kara Mustafa Pasha was a man who understood power from the inside out. He had not been born into the imperial family, but had risen through the elite Ottoman administrative corps, the very system designed to identify and cultivate talent. His position as Grand Vizier made him the Sultan's chief minister and the de facto ruler of the empire's day-to-day affairs, a testament to his political skill and unwavering loyalty to Sultan Mehmed IV. Yet this relationship was key to understanding the campaign against Vienna. The Sultan, more interested in hunting and palace life, was content to let his ambitious vizier pursue military glory. For Kara Mustafa, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. His vision was not merely to defeat an enemy, but to permanently reshape the map of Europe, with Vienna as the glittering new western jewel of the Ottoman Empire. This conquest would secure his legacy as the greatest of all viziers, a name spoken with awe for centuries. It was a deeply personal quest, and that personal stake would color every decision he made. To bring this vision to life required a feat of organization almost unimaginable for the era, moving an army that historians estimate at well over 100,000 men was not just about soldiers marching. It was an entire city on the move. Think of the supply lines alone, a river of carts carrying food, tents, and ammunition stretching for miles. Then there were the siege guns, monstrous bronze cannons that required teams of oxen and specialized engineers to transport over mountain passes and across rivers. This logistical nightmare was a testament to Ottoman engineering and administrative brilliance, but it also created a slow, deliberate pace. The army was a powerful but cumbersome instrument. This deliberate approach reflected Kara Mustafa's supreme confidence. Upon reaching Vienna in mid-July, he chose not to order an immediate, all-out assault on the city's formidable walls. Instead, he initiated a classic siege, encircling the city and beginning the methodical work of digging trenches and building earthworks to protect his own artillery positions. He believed time was on his side. The city, he was sure, would run out of supplies and hope long before his own vast resources were exhausted. He would win not through a risky, bloody storming of the walls, but through patience and overwhelming pressure. This choice, born of confidence, would grant the defenders a precious commodity they desperately needed: time. And time, in a siege, can change everything. While Kara Mustafa planned his patient conquest from the luxury of his command tent, life inside Vienna's walls became a slow, grinding struggle for survival. The city's defenses were a paradox of strength and vulnerability. Its medieval stone walls and towering bastions looked imposing, a testament to an older style of warfare. But against the massive, modern siege cannons the Ottomans were now positioning, these stone ramparts could become little more than targets. In charge of this desperate defense was a man whose own body seemed to mirror the city's condition: Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. Wounded and often ill during the siege, he nonetheless moved tirelessly along the battlements, his presence a stubborn symbol of resistance where hope was fading fast. His first terrible order was one of grim necessity. To make the city's limited food supplies last as long as possible, he commanded the expulsion of thousands of civilians, women, children, and the elderly. Imagine the heartbreak at the city gates, families torn apart, with those forced to leave facing an uncertain fate between the walls and the Ottoman lines. For those who remained, every day was a battle against hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless spread of illness. The diary of a citizen named Jan Sobieski, no relation to the king who would later arrive, records the creeping despair. He wrote of the constant, thunderous noise of the bombardment, a sound that became the backdrop to all life, and of the strange, unsettling silence that followed each explosion, filled only with the cries of the wounded. The defenders fought back with ingenuity and sheer desperation. By day, soldiers and volunteers worked under fire, using wooden beams and baskets of earth to shore up sections of walls shattered by cannonballs. By night, they faced a hidden, subterranean war. Ottoman sappers, experts in tunnel warfare, were digging deep beneath the fortifications to plant enormous gunpowder mines. The Viennese countered with their own miners, who would dig listening galleries, holding their breath to hear the faint scratch of enemy pickaxes, then dig to intercept and destroy the tunnels in frantic, claustrophobic clashes in the dark. Each sunrise brought a new count of the dead, a further reduction in rations, and the same view of an enemy camp that seemed to stretch to the horizon. They were holding on, but for what? Their prayers for a relieving army were beginning to feel like whispers against the Ottoman cannon's roar. The miracle they needed would have to arrive soon, or it would not arrive at all. The desperate pleas from Vienna did not fall on deaf ears, but they landed in a Europe fractured by old wounds. For a relief force to even exist, centuries of rivalry and suspicion had to be set aside, and that required a master of diplomacy. That figure was Pope Innocent XI. From Rome, he saw the siege not as a distant Habsburg problem, but as an existential crisis for all of Christian Europe. He became the relentless architect of unity, writing letters, offering funds, and framing the struggle in stark, spiritual terms. This was no longer just about saving an emperor's city, it was about defending a civilization. His most crucial success was bridging the deep chasm between two proud monarchs who viewed each other with profound distrust. On one side was Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, a cautious and deeply pious ruler whose own capital was under threat. On the other was King John III Sobieski of Poland, a brilliant military commander known as the Lion of Lekistan. Sobieski had his own reasons to fear Ottoman expansion, but agreeing to march his army hundreds of miles to save a rival emperor was a monumental political risk. The alliance they formed, brokered by the Pope, was a masterpiece of pragmatic necessity. It was not built on friendship, but on a cold, shared calculation that if Vienna fell, they would both be next. This fragile pact was the cornerstone of what became known as the Holy League. Around this core, contributions trickled in from across the German states. Princes from Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia, often more concerned with local disputes than a grand crusade, were persuaded by a mix of papal pressure, imperial authority, and the dawning realization of the common danger. What assembled was not a single, homogeneous army, but a coalition force, a patchwork of different languages, uniforms, and military traditions. They were united by little more than a shared enemy and the leadership of the man they all agreed should command them, John Sobieski. The politics of fear had, for a moment, overcome the politics of pride. Now, this assembled force had to march, and it had to win. The Allied army that finally began its march was a spectacle of both might and contradiction. At its heart were the Polish winged Hussars, a cavalry force unlike any other in Europe. These were not merely soldiers on horseback, they were a symbol of national pride and shock power, their iconic wooden frames adorned with eagle feathers creating a terrifying, angelic silhouette that hissed and rustled as they rode. Alongside them marched the disciplined, professional regiments of the Holy Roman Empire, hardened troops from Austria and the German states, each with their own flags and battle hymns. This coalition, however, was a logistical nightmare. Feeding and moving over 70,000 men and tens of thousands of horses through the difficult terrain of the Danube Valley was a monumental task. Supply wagons broke down, local forage was quickly exhausted, and the sheer noise of the army could be heard for miles, making secrecy impossible. King John Sobieski, now the agreed-upon commander of this unwieldy force, faced a constant struggle to keep his diverse contingents moving in unison, their progress a tense race against the calendar and the dwindling supplies in Vienna. Their final approach presented a critical strategic choice. Between them and the besieged city lay the dense, rolling hills of the Vienna woods. The obvious route was to march around the woods to the north, across the flat plains of the Danube, and launch a direct frontal assault on the sprawling Ottoman siege lines. This was what Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa expected them to do, and he had positioned his strongest defenses accordingly. But Sobieski, a master of terrain, saw a different path. He proposed a daring, difficult maneuver straight through the Vienna woods, emerging not on the plain, but on the high ridges of the Kollenberg and Leopoldsberg mountains that overlooked the entire battlefield from the northwest. It was a gamble. Moving an army of that size through narrow, forested tracks was slow and perilous, risking ambush or getting bogged down. Yet the reward was a position of supreme tactical advantage. From those heights, Sobieski could see the entire Ottoman camp, the city of Vienna, and the winding Danube River, all laid out like a map. He would own the high ground. The decision was made. For 2 grueling days, the Allied army snaked its way up the wooded slopes, engineers hacking paths for the cannons, men and horses straining against the gradient. As they crested the ridge on the evening of September 11th, the sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and sobering. Below, the countless campfires of the Ottoman host twinkled like a field of fallen stars, encircling the dark, battered silhouette of Vienna. The city's defenders, spotting the Allied signal fires on the mountaintop, rang their church bells in a desperate, joyful peal that carried across the silent plain. The stage for the final act was set, not on the flat ground where the Ottomans were strongest, but on the slopes where Sobieski planned to unleash his cavalry like a thunderbolt from the hills. The first light of September 11th revealed not an open plain for battle, but a dense, foggy woodland. The Allied army's descent from the Kollenberg heights began not with a grand charge, but with a careful, grinding advance through the Vienna woods. This was not the main event, but a crucial prologue, a series of sharp, brutal skirmishes as the coalition's vanguard, primarily Imperial Austrian troops under the Duke of Lorraine, pushed forward to clear the wooded slopes and secure the villages below. They fought for control of hamlets like Nussdorf and Heiligenstadt, each cluster of houses becoming a miniature fortress to be taken. These engagements were close quarters and chaotic, fought amidst vineyards and orchards, where the thunder of cannon was muffled by trees and the smoke of musket fire hung thick in the autumn air. Every yard of ground was contested, but the Allies, fighting downhill with growing momentum, steadily pushed the Ottoman outposts back. This relentless pressure served a vital purpose. It was carving out the space needed for Sobieski to deploy his main force, especially the massive Polish cavalry, onto the open ground at the foot of the hills. By the end of that first day, the Allies held a firm line along the ridges, their campfires a defiant answer to the sea of Ottoman lights below. Yet the Ottoman response to this looming threat was strangely divided. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha faced a commander's nightmare, a two-front battle. On one side, the walls of Vienna, so tantalizingly close to breach. On the other, a fresh, determined army now threatening his rear and flank. His critical error was his inability or unwillingness to choose a single focus. Instead of recalling his elite infantry, the Janissaries, from the siege trenches to form a powerful, unified field army to meet Sobieski, he left a significant portion of them digging and fighting in the city's approaches. He underestimated the relief force's speed and power, believing his fortified siege lines could hold them long enough for Vienna to finally fall. This decision meant his forces were dangerously overextended, stretched thin between two separate battles. The siege trenches still demanded thousands of men, while the field army arrayed against the Allies was a mix of cavalry, provincial troops, and only some of his best units. He was trying to win both fights at once, and in doing so, he risked losing everything. The skirmishes of the 11th were a test, and they revealed a critical weakness in the Ottoman disposition, a fatal split in attention that the Allied commanders noted with growing confidence. As darkness fell, the stage was cleared and the armies reformed, the entire theater now waiting for the single, decisive command to begin. The silence that settled over the Kollenberg Ridge at dawn on September 12th was not peaceful, it was dense with anticipation. From this commanding height, the entire theater of war lay exposed as a grim panorama. To the south, the city of Vienna stood shrouded in a haze of dust and lingering smoke from the constant bombardment, its battered walls looking impossibly small. Encircling it like a vast, disordered sea of colored tents and earthworks was the Ottoman camp, a city of war that had existed for 2 months, and arrayed along the wooded slopes facing this host was the Allied relief army, finally deployed in its full, terrible order. King John Sobieski had arranged his forces with deliberate, chess-like precision. On the left wing, closest to the Danube, were the imperial troops of the Duke of Lorraine, men fighting for their own emperor and homeland. Holding the center were the various contingents from the German states, a solid block of infantry and artillery, and on the right wing, occupying the highest ground and the position of greatest honor, were Sobieski's Poles, their distinctive winged hussars, a forest of feathers and lances waiting for the signal. This grand, sweeping line across the ridges was more than a formation, it was a statement. The battle plan was a slow, grinding hammer blow. The left and center would advance first, engaging the Ottoman lines and fixing them in place, drawing their reserves and attention. Then, and only then, would the Polish right wing, the massed cavalry held in reserve, be unleashed in a decisive, downhill charge aimed at shattering the Ottoman flank and rolling up their entire army. It was a strategy that required perfect timing and immense discipline. Below them, the Ottoman preparations betrayed a critical lack of cohesion. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, still refusing to fully abandon the siege, had not consolidated his best troops. His defensive lines were a mix of entrenched janissaries, provincial infantry, and the swift but lightly armored cavalry known as Sipahis, all arrayed in a broad arc but without a unified command structure to respond to a coordinated attack from the heights. For the common soldier on both sides looking across that misty valley, the scale of the moment was overwhelming. Many wrote later of praying, of checking their weapons repeatedly, of feeling the eyes of all history upon them. They were not just fighting for a city, they were standing at a hinge in time, and the order to advance would swing that hinge forever. The first movement of the battle was not a melody but a brutal, grinding rhythm. As the morning mist burned away, the Allied left and center began their descent from the wooded slopes, a tide of men in blue, red, and gray advancing under the relentless summer sun. This was not a reckless dash but a measured, disciplined push, each step bought with fire and steel. Their objective was the Ottoman forward lines, a network of trenches and fortified villages that anchored the enemy's position. The fighting converged on places like Nussdorf, a small village that became a vortex of violence. What had been a quiet cluster of homes and vineyards was now a deadly maze, with Ottoman musketeers firing from behind stone walls and from the upper windows of houses they had turned into strongpoints. To take it, the Allied infantry had to advance methodically, clearing each building and garden in bitter, close-quarters combat where the crack of muskets was followed by the sickening thud of bayonets and the clash of swords. The Allied advantage here was not numbers, but a devastating combination of technology and drilled cohesion. While Ottoman troops were often brave individual fighters, the European regiments moved as unified blocks. On command, entire ranks would halt, raise their muskets as one, and unleash a synchronized volley, a wall of lead and smoke that could shatter a charging formation. Then, while one rank reloaded, the rank behind would step forward to fire, maintaining a continuous, rolling barrage of fire. This disciplined firepower was the anvil against which Ottoman counterattacks broke. Time and again, groups of Sipahi cavalry or bands of janissaries would launch fierce, localized assaults, seeking to exploit a gap or break the Allied momentum. Each time they were met with these disciplined volleys and the steady advance of men who held their line. The Allied artillery, having been painstakingly dragged down from the heights, added its own terrible voice to the chorus. These field guns, lighter and more mobile than the massive siege cannons bombarding Vienna, were positioned on small rises to fire canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with metal balls that turned advancing infantry into a horrific scene of loss. For hours, this brutal exchange continued across a front that stretched for miles. The battle was a series of intense, localized struggles for a fortified hamlet, a line of trenches, a hedgerow. Progress was measured in yards, not miles, and the cost was steep on both sides. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder, dust, and the undeniable scent of conflict. This relentless infantry engagement, however, was achieving its crucial, unglamorous purpose. It was fixing the Ottoman army in place, drawing their reserves forward to plug gaps in the line, and slowly, inexorably, wearing down their strength and morale. Every Ottoman unit committed to stopping this grinding advance was a unit not available to face the true threat still waiting patiently on the right wing. The stage was being set not by a single heroic act, but by the collective endurance of thousands of ordinary soldiers, whose sacrifice created the precise conditions for legend to take its ride. From his vantage point on the ridge, King John Sobieski watched the brutal contest below with the calm eye of a master chess player. The smoke and clamor of the infantry battle, while fierce, told him exactly what he needed to know. The Ottoman lines were bending, their commanders funneling more and more units into the desperate struggle in the center to stop the Allied advance. This was the moment he had orchestrated. The enemy was fully committed, their reserves drawn into the fray, leaving their flank vulnerable. It was time. A series of crisp orders echoed down the line, and across the Polish right wing, a transformation began. What had been a waiting force of men and horses now stirred into a deliberate, awe-inspiring assembly. From across the hillside, squadrons of cavalry converged, forming into a single, massive block of steel and muscle. The sight was calculated to inspire terror in any who saw it from below. At the forefront were Sobieski's pride, the Polish winged Hussars. Each rider's back was framed by a wooden arch adorned with eagle, ostrich, or swan feathers, which hissed and rustled with the slightest movement, creating an otherworldly sound and a silhouette of winged angels of death. They were the ultimate shock cavalry, armed with long, slender lances designed to shatter infantry formations on contact. Flanking them were the heavy cavalry of the German states, the cuirassiers, men encased in polished steel breastplates who resembled moving fortresses, their broadswords ready for the close work after the initial charge. To their side were the Austrian cavalry, lighter and faster, intended to exploit any breach and chase down a broken foe. Together, they formed a weapon of unprecedented scale and power, thousands of horses and riders packed into a formation nearly a mile wide. This moment of massing was not rushed. It was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying ritual. Riders checked their girths and lances, commanders offered final brief prayers, and a profound, anticipatory quiet settled over the ranks, broken only by the snort of horses and the distant thunder of the ongoing battle. Sobieski was pausing for a final, calculated breath. He was about to stake everything, the fate of Vienna, the alliance, his own legacy, on a single, monumental gamble. In an age where warfare was increasingly defined by gunpowder, trenches, and disciplined volleys, he was preparing to unleash the medieval concept of the decisive cavalry charge on a modern battlefield. The entire theory of his strategy, and perhaps the future of Europe, now rested on the shoulders of these knights and the momentum of their horses. Then the ground itself began to speak. The signal was given, and the greatest cavalry charge in European history began to move. It did not start at a gallop, but with a disciplined, rolling walk that quickly shifted into a steady trot. The sound was already immense, a deep, rhythmic thunder of tens of thousands of hooves striking the earth in unison, churning the dry soil of the hillside into a rising cloud of dust. As the slope steepened, the pace quickened to a canter, the formations holding with incredible precision. A solid wall of men, horses, and lances tipped forward like a bristling forest. Then, as they hit the final, open ground before the Ottoman flank, the command to charge rang out. The trot erupted into an earth-shattering, full-tilt gallop. Contemporary Polish chroniclers would later write that the very hills seemed to tremble, and that the noise was not of individual horses, but of a single, continuous roar, like an avalanche given form. The psychological effect of the winged Hussars was as potent as their physical impact. To the weary Ottoman troops looking up, it must have seemed like a vision from a nightmare. The sun, now lowering in the west, caught the tips of their lances and the polished steel of their armor, transforming the charge into a moving wall of blinding light. Above each rider, those iconic wooden wings created a terrifying, rustling hiss that mixed with the thunder of hooves, a sound meant to panic enemy horses and unnerve infantry. It was the perfect storm of sight and sound, designed to break a line before a single lance made contact. The primary weapon in this storm was the lance itself. Each hussar carried a hollow, lightweight lance over 15 feet long, tipped with a sharp steel point. Its purpose was not for dueling, but for pure, concentrated penetration. Held under the arm, it acted as an extension of the horse's momentum, a focused spike of force aimed at breaking the cohesion of an infantry square. The sheer mass of the formation multiplied this power exponentially. This was not a skirmish line, but a deep, heavy block of cavalry, where the weight and speed of the second and third ranks added irresistible force to the impact of the first. They struck the Ottoman flank not as a series of individual blows, but as a single, catastrophic event. The point of impact was not against fresh troops, but against units already bloodied and exhausted from hours of fighting the Allied infantry. The Ottoman lines here, a mix of Sipahi cavalry and provincial infantry, were simply overwhelmed. The first rank was shattered, lances piercing shields and armor, the momentum carrying horses and riders deep into the formation. The disciplined charge then transformed into a rolling melee, a brutal pushing match where the weight of the Allied cavalry continued to press forward, trampling and scattering all resistance. The Ottoman flank didn't just bend, it disintegrated. What had been a hard-fought battle of attrition moments before now turned into a sudden, cascading rout. The cavalry, having broken through, began to wheel and drive parallel to the Ottoman front, rolling up their line from the side and sweeping toward the heart of the camp itself. In the span of minutes, the entire strategic picture had been inverted. The charge did not stop at breaking the enemy line. It flowed like a steel river into the heart of the Ottoman camp itself. This was the moment of total collapse. The vast, sprawling city of tents and pavilions, which had housed an army for 2 months, was now overrun by the very force it had been built to besiege. The scene transformed from a battlefield into one of utter chaos and sudden, overwhelming reversal. Ottoman soldiers, from the elite janissaries to the supporting troops, now thought only of escape. They streamed eastward, away from the terrifying rumble of hooves, abandoning everything. The ground was littered with the material evidence of their shattered ambition. Priceless siege cannons left silent in their emplacements, mountains of grain and ammunition, and chests filled with silver and silk intended as the spoils of a conquered Vienna. Most symbolically powerful of all, in the frantic retreat, the Ottomans lost their most sacred military banner, the banner of the Prophet. This was not merely a flag, it was a relic of immense spiritual significance, believed to have been carried by the founder of their faith. Its capture was a psychological blow as devastating as any military defeat, a sign that divine favor had turned against them. As the Allied cavalry secured the camp, a simultaneous eruption of hope occurred within Vienna's walls. Exhausted defenders on the ramparts, who had watched the distant drama unfold as a cloud of dust and noise, now saw the Ottoman lines dissolve. The sound of the enemy's panic replaced the thunder of their cannons. With a surge of renewed strength, the garrison commander, Starhemberg, ordered the gates flung open. His ragged troops, joined by armed citizens, poured out to attack the few remaining Ottoman positions from the rear. This was no longer a defense, it was a shared liberation. The two forces, the relievers and the relieved, met amidst the smoking ruins of the siege works. The strategic objective of the Great Charge was now complete. Vienna was saved not just by holding its walls, but by the utter destruction of the army that surrounded it. The starving city, on the brink of surrender that very morning, was suddenly flooded with food from the captured Ottoman stores. King John Sobieski, riding into the conquered camp, would famously send a simple, triumphant message to the Pope, paraphrasing a famous Roman general, "I came, I saw, God conquered." Yet the true victory belonged to every soldier who had held the line and every rider who had joined that fateful descent. They had turned a slow, grinding siege into a single, breathtaking afternoon that reshaped the map of a continent. But victory on the battlefield is a fleeting moment, soon replaced by the heavy reality of what it leaves behind. As the last Ottoman troops disappeared into the eastern dusk, the Allies faced a landscape transformed. The immediate pursuit was surprisingly limited, a deliberate choice by commanders who understood their exhausted men and horses were in no condition for a long chase across unfamiliar territory. The priority now was securing the camp and the city, a task that revealed the staggering scale of the Ottoman defeat. The plunder captured was beyond imagination, a king's ransom left behind in the panic. Mountains of grain, silk, and silver coins filled the tents, but one particular find would weave itself into the cultural fabric of Europe. Among the abandoned supplies were sacks of strange, dark beans, a provision meant for the Ottoman officers. These were coffee beans, and their discovery in such quantity led directly to the opening of the first Viennese coffee houses, transforming the city's social life and introducing a beverage that would become a continental obsession. This unexpected cultural transfer, born from the spoils of war, is a quiet footnote to the day's thunder, yet the camp also held far grimmer treasures. The task of dealing with the fallen was immense and sobering. For days afterward, the plain outside Vienna was a place of solemn, exhausting labor. Burial details, often prisoners or local peasants pressed into service, worked to provide resting places for the thousands who would not return home. The human cost of that single afternoon was profound. While the Allied forces suffered losses, historians estimate in the low thousands, the Ottoman army paid a far heavier price. Tens of thousands of their soldiers fell, with many more lost in the disorganized retreat that followed. These numbers are not just statistics, they represent a collective story of individual hardship and sacrifice, a reminder that the grand narratives of history are built upon countless personal endings. The legendary charge had saved a city and shifted the balance of power, but it also left the land scarred and families across 2 continents awaiting news that would never come. The cleanup was a silent, grinding counterpoint to the day's glory, a necessary process that grounded the soaring legend in the enduring truth of human loss. The man who orchestrated that thunderous descent was already a legend long before he reached Vienna. King John III Sobieski of Poland was a soldier king in the truest sense, a monarch who had earned his crown on the battlefield defending the Commonwealth's eastern frontiers. His reputation was built on a series of brilliant, mobile campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and its allies, victories like the Battle of Cotton, which showcased his mastery of terrain and his innovative use of combined arms tactics. He understood the power of cavalry not as a relic but as a precise instrument, and he commanded the loyalty of his winged hussars with a warrior's respect. Yet for all his military genius, his political position at home was complex and often fragile. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a unique entity, a republic of nobles where the king's power was sharply checked by a powerful parliament. Sobieski's great ambition was to strengthen the monarchy, to centralize authority and secure his dynasty's future, dreams that often clashed with the entrenched interests of the noble class. The campaign to relieve Vienna, therefore, was not just a crusade, it was a high-stakes political maneuver. Success would grant him immense prestige, positioning him as the savior of Christendom and potentially giving him the leverage he needed at home. His personal leadership on that September day was the culmination of this lifelong balancing act. He was not a distant commander issuing orders from a hilltop. He was at the head of his Polish cavalry, placing himself in the thick of the decisive charge. This was both a calculated risk and a statement of identity, proving he was first and foremost a warrior leading his men. His famous dispatch to the Pope after the battle, written in Latin, encapsulated this blend of martial pride and pious humility. Veni, vidi, Deus visit, I came, I saw, God conquered. It was a masterful piece of messaging, crediting divine will while ensuring his own role was forever inscribed in the historical record. almost immediately the myth-making began. Across Europe, pamphlets and paintings celebrated Sobieski as the savior king, a new Alexander or Caesar. In Poland, he was hailed as the defender of the faith and the shield of Europe, his victory at Vienna representing the absolute peak of Polish military prestige and international influence. Yet this glorious myth soon outpaced political reality. In the years that followed, his dreams of a strong, hereditary monarchy founded against the same parliamentary forces as before, and his later military campaigns lacked the decisive, world-altering impact of Vienna. The man who had saved a capital found his own political power gradually waning. This contrast is what makes his story so compelling, the separation between the immortal legend and the mortal ruler. His genuine role in the coalition's success, however, is beyond dispute. It was his strategic vision that chose the route through the Vienna woods, his tactical patience that held the cavalry in reserve until the perfect moment, and his personal authority that welded a fractious coalition into a weapon capable of that single, unified strike. He was the indispensable catalyst, the commander who understood that to break a siege of such magnitude, you needed to do more than fight a battle. You needed to stage a spectacle of deliverance. While the spotlight of history shines brightly on the Polish king, it often leaves another commander in the shadows, a man whose steady hand was just as vital to the victory. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, was the senior imperial commander, a veteran whose career had been a masterclass in navigating the complex politics and brutal warfare of his time. Unlike the flamboyant Sobieski, Lorraine's genius was one of meticulous planning, patient maneuvering, and a profound understanding of what an army could endure. In the months leading up to the siege, he had already been fighting a desperate war of movement against the advancing Ottomans, conducting a series of strategic retreats that, while painful, preserved the core of the imperial army from annihilation. This was not glamorous work, but it was essential, ensuring that when the call to relieve Vienna came, there was still a professional Austrian force left to answer it. His contribution during the relief march was equally foundational. It was Lorraine, intimately familiar with the Danube Valley's geography, who worked closely with Sobieski to plan the daring route through the Vienna woods, calculating supply lines and arguing for the high ground advantage. On the day of the battle itself, his role was arguably the most grueling. Commanding the Allied left wing, his imperial and German troops were tasked with the bloody, grinding work of the initial advance. They were the anvil fixing the Ottoman army in place through hours of brutal infantry combat, absorbing counterattacks and wearing down the enemy's strength. This unglamorous, sacrificial fighting created the precise conditions of fatigue and commitment that made the Polish cavalry's charge so devastatingly effective. Think of it as a perfectly timed theatrical production. Lorraine's forces staged the lengthy, intense opening acts, drawing all eyes to the center stage and exhausting the opponent. This set the scene, built the tension, and left the flank exposed. Only then could Sobieski, the star performer, make his breathtaking entrance for the final, show-stopping climax. One could not have worked without the other. The dramatic, war-winning charge was only possible because of the solid, strategic framework Lorraine had helped build and the sacrifice of the men he commanded. Great historical victories are rarely the work of a lone genius, but rather a symphony of different talents. Where Sobieski provided the thunderous crescendo, Charles of Lorraine composed the steady, compelling score that made the entire piece coherent. To overlook his role is to misunderstand how history is truly made, not in a single moment of brilliance, but through the sustained collaboration of capable minds, each playing their indispensable part. Amidst the chaos of the abandoned camp, one object stood apart from the chests of silver and sacks of grain. It was a banner, but not an ordinary regimental flag. This was the Sancak-i Serif, the holy standard of the Prophet, a relic of immense spiritual power for the Ottoman Empire. To understand its capture is to grasp how a single piece of silk could magnify a military disaster into a crisis of faith. For the Ottomans, this banner was far more than a commander's signal. It was believed to have been carried by the Prophet Muhammad himself in early battles, and later safeguarded by the caliphs in Damascus and then Constantinople. When the Sultan went to war, this sacred banner traveled with the army, housed in its own special tent and guarded by the most devout soldiers. Its presence was a tangible promise of divine favor, a direct link between the campaign and the very foundations of their faith. It represented the Sultan's dual role as both political ruler and protector of Islam. To lose it was unthinkable. Its journey after the battle tells its own story of symbolic victory. King John Sobieski, recognizing its profound significance, did not keep it as a personal trophy. Instead, he sent it to Rome as a gift for Pope Innocent XI, the architect of the Holy League. This was a masterstroke of political and religious theater. In European capitals, news of the banner's capture spread faster than the battle details themselves. It was reproduced in engravings and described in triumphant pamphlets. Here was physical, undeniable proof that God had intervened on the side of Christendom. The Ottoman invincibility, a psychological force that had haunted Europe for centuries, was now materially broken, represented by this piece of captured cloth displayed far from home. The victory was framed not just as a strategic success, but as a spiritual vindication. For the Ottoman Empire, the loss was a wound that went deeper than any battlefield reversal. While a defeated army could be rebuilt, the loss of such a sacred symbol struck at the empire's spiritual confidence and the Sultan's own legitimacy as a leader. It raised unsettling questions. Had divine will turned against them? The psychological and propaganda value of the banner was so great that, according to some accounts, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha desperately tried to conceal the news of its loss as he retreated, fearing the devastating impact on morale and his own precarious position. The object became a silent, powerful character in the aftermath, its absence speaking louder than any proclamation of victory. This is how history often works, the grand sweep of events crystallized into a single artifact. The banner of the Prophet, a rectangle of fabric, came to encapsulate the entire meaning of the siege, a trophy that told a story of shifted fortunes, broken aura, and a day when the tide of an empire, at least for a while, was decisively turned back. So did that single, thunderous charge truly save Europe? For centuries, the answer seemed obvious. The traditional narrative paints the victory at Vienna as the definitive turning point, the moment the Ottoman tide was permanently rolled back from the heart of the continent. In this view, the broken siege didn't just rescue a city, it shattered an empire's westward ambition forever, securing a Christian Europe and allowing its culture to flourish unchallenged from the east. It's a powerful, satisfying story, one that places that September afternoon as the crucial hinge upon which our modern world swung into being. But history, when examined closely, often resists such clean, decisive labels. Modern scholarship invites us to look beyond the immediate drama of the battlefield. The Ottoman Empire of 1683 was indeed a colossus, but it was a colossus facing immense internal strains. Its administration was becoming unwieldy, its economy faced challenges, and it was engaged in conflicts on multiple frontiers. The campaign against Vienna itself was a massive gamble, stretching its logistical capabilities to the limit. Even if the city had fallen, holding it and pushing further into Central Europe would have been a monumental, perhaps impossible, task against a now united opposition. The idea of Ottoman armies marching unopposed to the English Channel, a fear whispered at the time, seems less plausible when we consider the sheer difficulty of projecting power so far from home. Furthermore, the war did not end with the relief of Vienna. What followed was a grueling series of campaigns known as the Great Turkish War, or the Long War, which dragged on for another 16 years. Battles were won and lost, territories changed hands, and the conflict only concluded with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. Vienna was not the end of the story, but a spectacular, morale-shifting opening chapter in a much longer struggle. This leads us to a deeper, more philosophical question about history itself. What does it mean to save a civilization? Is it a single, dramatic event, or is it the slow accumulation of cultural resilience, economic strength, and social cohesion? By focusing so intently on the cavalry charge, we risk falling into a deterministic trap, believing that the entire course of future events was irrevocably set that day. This can overshadow the countless other factors, from agricultural innovations to shifting trade routes, that equally shaped Europe's development. Perhaps a more useful way to think about Vienna is not as a simple salvation event, but as a powerful catalyst. It demonstrated that the Ottoman advance could be decisively beaten in a major set-piece battle. It solidified a fragile military coalition that would continue to fight. And it created an unshakable legend of European resilience that fueled confidence for generations. The charge didn't single-handedly determine the future, but it profoundly altered the momentum of the present, making certain futures far more likely than others. The true impact lies in this interplay between the dramatic moment and the enduring currents of history, a reminder that while we remember the day the hills shook, the path of a continent is carved by much more than a single afternoon's glory. The clatter of lances at Vienna seems to echo from a bygone age. In the century that followed, the battlefield would belong to the disciplined infantry square and the massed volley of muskets, rendering the classic heavy cavalry charge increasingly obsolete. So does that make the Polish Hussars a magnificent anachronism, a final, glorious flare of medieval warfare before the modern era extinguished it? The answer is more nuanced and reveals why Vienna is such a fascinating case study in military evolution. The charge succeeded not because it defied the new rules of war, but because King Sobieski understood how to integrate it within them. This was not a standalone act of knightly valor, but the culminating move in a carefully orchestrated symphony of combined arms. The grinding infantry advance of the Allied center, the supporting fire of the field artillery, these elements were not separate from the cavalry, they were essential to its success. They fixed the Ottoman army in place, absorbed its attention, and wore down its cohesion, creating the precise conditions of fatigue and distraction that allowed the massed cavalry to strike a decisive blow. In that specific context, on that terrain, against an overextended enemy, heavy cavalry proved it still had a devastating role to play as the hammer to the infantry's anvil. Vienna was less a rejection of the emerging military revolution and more a masterclass in using every tool available, old and new, in perfect concert. This exposes a critical vulnerability in the Ottoman military model, which had been so effective for centuries. The Ottoman army was a formidable, multifaceted instrument, brilliant at siege warfare, amphibious operations, and rapid conquest. Its strength lay in its diversity, a system that incorporated elite professional corps like the Janissaries with provincial cavalry and auxiliary troops. Yet at Vienna, this very structure revealed a weakness in open field battle against a coordinated European force. The Ottoman command system, centered on the Grand Vizier, could be slow to adapt to a fluid tactical situation. More importantly, the different components of the army, each formidable in their own right, did not always operate with the seamless integration demonstrated by the Allies. The Sipahi cavalry launched brave but piecemeal counterattacks. The Janissaries remained partly committed to the siege lines, and the artillery was largely static. They fought as distinct units responding to a crisis, not as a unified organism executing a counter-strategy. The battle highlighted a shift in the nature of European warfare, toward greater standardization, drill, and inter-arms cooperation, a trend that would only accelerate after 1683. So we are left with a powerful duality. The Siege of Vienna stands at a crossroads in military history, a point where the old way of war delivered one last, world-altering victory precisely because it was wielded by a commander who understood the new way. It was both an ending and a beginning, a testament to the enduring value of shock and momentum, but also a clear sign that future battles would be won by coordination, discipline, and the efficient fusion of all elements on the field. The echo of those hooves faded, but the lessons written on that plain would be studied for generations to come. While the dust settled on the battlefield, another kind of creation was just beginning. The victory at Vienna was too monumental, too charged with meaning to be left as mere history. It demanded to be transformed into art, into music, into a story a society could tell itself about its own survival. This cultural processing turned a military event into a lasting legend, shaping how generations would understand their own identity. In the grand Baroque churches and palaces of Europe, artists got to work almost immediately. They painted King John Sobieski not as a mortal king, but as a celestial liberator, a figure on a rearing white horse, often bathed in heavenly light, with angels placing a laurel wreath upon his head. In these canvases, the winged Hussars appear less as soldiers and more as archangels, their charge a divine intervention. One famous fresco in the Wilanow Palace in Warsaw shows Sobieski presenting the captured Ottoman banners to the Virgin Mary, directly linking the earthly victory to sacred patronage. This was history as theology, a visual sermon proclaiming that God had indeed conquered. The celebration also found its voice in music. Composers across the continent produced grand oratorios and festive masses to mark the occasion. One of the most notable was by the Austrian composer Johann Joseph Fuchs, whose work Concentus Musico Instrumentales was performed in Vienna to give thanks for the city's deliverance. These compositions were not subtle, they were triumphant, full of booming choruses and brilliant fanfares designed to stir pride and piety in equal measure. They turned the complex, bloody reality of the siege into a harmonious, uplifting narrative of salvation, an auditory monument as solid as any statue. As the centuries turned, the memory of Vienna evolved to serve new purposes. In the 19th century, with Poland erased from the map by its neighbors, the story of Sobieski's triumph became a vital source of national pride for a people without a state. Polish poets and painters revisited the siege, portraying it as proof of their nation's historic role as the Antemurale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christendom. It was a comforting reminder of past glory during a time of present hardship. In Austria, the memory was woven into the fabric of the Habsburg monarchy's identity, a foundational myth of Catholic unity and imperial resilience that helped bind a diverse empire together. Perhaps the most delicious evidence of how this history embeds itself in popular consciousness is a simple pastry. The legend of the Croissant, that buttery, crescent-shaped roll, is intimately tied to the siege. As the story goes, Viennese bakers, working before dawn, heard the Ottomans tunneling under the city and raised the alarm, saving the day. To celebrate, they created a pastry in the shape of the crescent moon from the Ottoman flag, so that citizens could literally devour their enemy's symbol. While historians note that similar pastries existed earlier, the power of the tale is undeniable. It connects a global breakfast staple to a specific moment of peril and triumph, making history something you can taste. This is how a society remembers, not just with textbooks, but with the stories told over a cup of coffee and a flaky roll. These echoes in art, music, and myth demonstrate a profound truth. History is never just about what happened. It is equally about what we choose to remember and how we reshape those memories to inspire, to unite, or simply to make sense of our place in the world. The siege left behind more than a changed border. It left an enduring story, one that nations and individuals have been retelling in their own image ever since. The final thunder of the cavalry charge did not signal peace, but a profound shift in momentum. Vienna's salvation was not a curtain falling on the conflict, but a curtain rising on an entirely new act, a war that would redefine the map of southeastern Europe for the next 2 centuries. Historians call this the Great Turkish War, or sometimes the Long War, a relentless, grinding series of campaigns that began in the glow of that victory and lasted for 16 more years. This was the true geopolitical ripple effect of that September afternoon, where the Habsburgs, so long on the defensive, seized the initiative and began a slow, methodical rollback of Ottoman power. The confidence born at Vienna translated into a sustained offensive, a campaign of reconquest aimed at the ancient kingdom of Hungary, which had been under Ottoman control for over 150 years. The battles that followed, names like Mohacs and Zenta, were hard-fought and costly, but they consistently pushed the frontier eastward. This was no longer about defending a bulwark. It was about reclaiming a realm, village by village, fortress by fortress, in a war of attrition that tested the resources and resolve of both empires. The ultimate conclusion of this epochal struggle was not signed on a battlefield, but at a negotiating table in the town of Karlowitz in 1699. The Treaty of Karlowitz is the document that formalized the new reality. For the first time in its long history, the Ottoman Empire was forced to sign a peace treaty not as an equal, but as a party that had lost significant territory. It ceded the vast majority of Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of Croatia and Slovenia to the Habsburg monarchy. This was not a minor border adjustment. It was a massive transfer of land and people, redrawing the political and religious landscape of the Danube basin. The treaty established a new, more stable frontier, one guarded by a line of Habsburg fortifications that would stand for generations. It marked the definitive end of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe and the beginning of a long, gradual period of retreat. So, how do we connect the dots between a single, spectacular cavalry charge and a peace treaty signed years later? The victory at Vienna was the essential catalyst. It broke the aura of Ottoman invincibility that had paralyzed European diplomacy for generations. It proved that their armies could be decisively beaten in a major field battle, which galvanized the Holy League and secured continued funding and political will for the long campaign ahead. More than anything, it provided an irrefutable symbol, a story of deliverance that leaders could point to, a reason to believe that the long, costly process of reconquest was possible. The charge did not win the Great Turkish War by itself, but it created the precise conditions of hope, unity, and momentum that made winning such a war conceivable. In this way, the echoes of those hooves did not fade. They simply transformed, reverberating through decades of diplomacy and conflict until they were finally etched in ink onto a new map of the world. Yet the story told in Vienna's churches and Warsaw's palaces is only one version of that September. Across the border, in the halls of the Ottoman court, the very same events were being recorded and remembered through an entirely different lens. For the empire that had retreated from the gates of the city, the defeat was not a story of divine judgment or a heroic last stand, but a tale of internal failure and misguided ambition. Official Ottoman chronicles and internal reports from the time placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of one man, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. The narrative crafted in Constantinople was not one of being outfought by a superior coalition, but of being betrayed by the arrogance and tactical errors of their own commander. His decision to continue the siege rather than turn his full force against the relief army was painted as a fatal blunder, a personal failing that squandered the strength of the Sultan's military. This framing served a crucial political purpose. By scapegoating the vizier, the Sultan and the court could preserve the idea of the empire's inherent strength and divine favor. The defeat was an anomaly, a temporary setback caused by human error, not a sign of systemic weakness or a shift in the balance of power. The consequence for Kara Mustafa was grimly definitive. Upon his return, he was not hailed as a hero who had tried, but was arrested, stripped of his office, and, following tradition, executed by strangulation with a silk cord. His head was sent to the Sultan as proof. In the Ottoman memory, the siege became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreach and the price of poor leadership, a closed chapter of internal correction rather than an opening chapter of decline. This divergence in memory only widens when we look to the modern day. In much of Western education and popular culture, 1683 remains a potent symbol, often simplified into a decisive clash between civilizations, a clear-cut victory of West over East. It is frequently presented as the moment the Ottoman tide was permanently turned, a foundational story in the narrative of European identity. This view, while powerful, can sometimes overlook the complex 16-year war that followed and the many other factors shaping history. Meanwhile, in modern Turkey, the memory of the siege occupies a more nuanced and quieter space. Turkish historiography, especially in the secular republic founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, often approaches the event with academic distance. It is studied less as a traumatic national defeat and more as one episode in the long, complex history of the Ottoman Empire, an empire whose legacy the modern state views with a mixture of pride and critical analysis. The focus for Turkish scholars is frequently on the internal dynamics of the Ottoman state, the logistical challenges of the campaign, and the political aftermath within the court, rather than on framing it as a civilizational crossroads. For the general public, it does not hold the same central, mythic status that it does in Poland or Austria. The dominant national narrative in Turkey looks to different triumphs and tragedies, to the founding of the Republic or the Battle of Gallipoli, for its defining stories of identity and resilience. Placing these two perspectives side by side does something remarkable. It restores depth to a story that can easily become a flat legend. It reminds us that history is not a single, fixed record of what happened, but a collection of stories we tell ourselves about what happened, stories shaped by culture, need, and identity. The same cloud of dust rising from the plain outside Vienna was seen by a Polish Hussar as a charge to salvation, by an Ottoman janissary as a collapse of order, and by a Viennese baker as the dawn of a new day and perhaps a new pastry. Each perspective contains a piece of the truth, and none contain the whole of it. This is not to say that facts do not matter, but that the meaning we weave from those facts is profoundly human. By listening for these echoes from both sides of the battlefield, we move closer to understanding not just the event, but the many worlds it changed and the many ways it is still remembered. The stories passed down through paintings and treaties are powerful, but they are not the only records of that day. Beneath the soil of the Vienna woods, a different kind of history lies waiting, silent and solid. Modern archaeology has turned its tools to those rolling hills, not to rewrite the grand narrative, but to listen to the whispers it left behind. When teams of researchers sweep the fields and forests with metal detectors, they do not find glorious banners or royal seals. They recover the humble, everyday objects dropped in the heat and terror of the moment. A lead musket ball flattened from impact, a rusted buckle from a soldier's belt. A broken clay pipe, a single brass button. Each one is a tiny, tangible point of contact with an individual who was there. These scattered fragments are the physical echo of the battle's chaos, a map written in metal and lost possessions. By carefully plotting where these artifacts are found, archaeologists can do something remarkable. They can trace the lines of advance and retreat with a precision no written account can match. Concentrations of certain types of musket balls can indicate where infantry squares stood and fired. The spread of cavalry fittings can help chart the path of the great charge itself. This evidence on the ground often confirms the broad strokes of historical reports. but it also adds granular human detail, verifying where the fighting was most intense and how the formations actually moved across the challenging terrain. These finds also tell us about the material world of the soldiers. The design of a button can identify its owner's regiment. The origin of a clay pipe can hint at where a soldier came from or what comforts he carried. A carefully carved gaming piece speaks of long hours in camp, of boredom and camaraderie before the storm. This is history from the ground up, focusing not on kings and viziers, but on the thousands of ordinary men whose combined actions decided the day. Yet this buried archive faces its own modern threats. The historic landscape around Vienna is not a museum. It is a living, growing urban area. New roads, housing developments, and commercial projects constantly press against these historic fields. This creates an ongoing tension between preservation and progress. Local historical societies and archaeologists often work urgently to survey land slated for development, racing to recover what they can before it is lost beneath concrete. Their work ensures that even as the city expands, the physical memory of the battle is not entirely paved over. There is a profound power in holding a cannonball pulled from the earth where it fell centuries ago. It transforms the epic story from a distant legend into something immediate and visceral. That weight in your hand is a direct link to the thunder of the guns, the smell of burnt powder, and the vibrations felt through the boots of the men who stood there. Archaeology does not just study the past, it allows us for a moment to touch it, grounding the sweeping currents of history in the solid, undeniable reality of a single, rusted piece of iron. The legend of Vienna is so powerful that it has, over centuries, gathered its own coat of myth. One of the most persistent stories paints the victory as a singular Polish triumph, a narrative where King John Sobieski and his winged Hussars arrived alone to save the day. This makes for a stirring national epic, but it obscures the fundamental truth of the battle. Vienna was saved by a coalition. The Polish cavalry was the decisive spearhead, the hammer that struck the final blow, but it could not have succeeded without the anvil. That anvil was the multinational force of the Holy Roman Empire, the troops from Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, and other German states who fought the grueling, hours-long infantry battle that fixed the Ottoman army in place. They absorbed the counterattacks and wore down the enemy's strength, creating the exact conditions of fatigue and distraction that made the Great Charge possible. To credit one contingent alone is to misunderstand the very nature of coalition warfare, where success depends not on a single hero, but on the synchronized effort of many. This leads to another visual myth, the image of the winged Hussars charging in splendid isolation. They did not ride alone. The charge was a combined cavalry effort. Alongside the Polish horsemen rode the heavy cuirassiers of the German states, men clad in steel breastplates, as well as lighter Austrian cavalry units. They formed a massive, unified front of thousands of horses, a combined weight of metal and momentum that no single cavalry corps could have mustered. The charge was a symphony, not a solo. Similarly, the numbers often cited for the armies have swollen in legend. You will sometimes hear of 200,000 Ottomans facing a tiny relief force. While the Ottoman army was immense, likely well over 100,000, the Allied relief army was also substantial, modern estimates placing it between 65 and 75,000 men. This was not a tiny band of heroes against an endless horde. It was a major clash between two enormous professional armies. Exaggerating the numbers, while dramatic, can unintentionally diminish the real achievement of coordination and strategy that won the day. Perhaps the most significant misconception is framing the entire conflict as a simple, clear-cut clash between Islam and Christendom. This overlooks the deeply complicated political realities of the 17th century. On the Ottoman side, their forces included Christian vassals from regions like Moldavia and Wallachia. More notably, Their formidable cavalry often included Crimean Tatars, who were Muslim, but whose allegiance was based on complex political and tributary relationships with the Sultan, not solely on religious unity. The battle lines were not drawn purely by faith. Conversely, in Europe, the primary motivation for many German princes to join the Holy League was not religious fervor, but hard-headed political calculation and fear of Ottoman expansion threatening their own lands. The Pope's call provided a unifying banner, but beneath it lay a web of secular interests, rivalries, and pragmatic survival instincts. Reducing this to a holy war simplifies a rich, messy tapestry of human motives into a single thread. Why do these myths persist? Often, they serve a purpose. A simplified story of good versus evil, or of a lone savior, is easier to remember and more powerful for building national identity than a complex tale of logistics, diplomacy, and allied friction. These stories become cultural shorthand, but embracing the nuanced truth is far more empowering. It reveals history as it actually was, a human endeavor full of cooperation and conflict, mixed motives and unexpected alliances. It shows us that grand historical turning points are rarely the work of one nation or one idea, but are forged in the messy, collaborative, and often contradictory actions of many. By setting aside the folklore, we do not lose the drama of Vienna. We gain a deeper appreciation for the real, intricate mechanics of how history is made. History's great turning points are not just about armies and empires. They are masterclasses in human leadership under pressure. The drama outside Vienna offers a stark study in contrasts, a playbook of what to emulate and what to avoid, written not in theory but in the dust of a real battlefield. The first and perhaps most difficult lesson is the art of coalition command. King John Sobieski led an army of different languages, loyalties, and military traditions, a force rife with potential for friction and failure. His authority was not absolute, it was negotiated. Yet he succeeded by establishing a clear, unified objective that every contingent could support, saving the city, and then granting each group a defined role within a larger, coherent plan. He did not demand they become a single army. He orchestrated their differences into a symphony. This is the timeless challenge of any joint venture, whether in boardrooms or international diplomacy. Aligning diverse interests toward a common goal requires a vision strong enough to unite, yet flexible enough to accommodate different strengths. Another principle carved into the landscape itself is the supremacy of logistics and terrain. Sobieski's bold decision to march through the Vienna woods was a logistical gamble of immense scale, moving thousands of men and horses over difficult ground. But it was a calculated risk that traded short-term difficulty for long-term advantage, securing the high ground and dictating the terms of the battle. Conversely, the Ottoman host, for all its might, became a prisoner of its own sprawling siege lines. Its supply lines stretched thin, and its forces divided between two objectives. In any complex endeavor, from launching a product to planning a community project, the unseen work of preparation and positioning often determines success long before the main event begins. Where you choose to make your stand, physically or metaphorically, can be more important than how hard you fight. Then there is the fragile element of morale, the invisible force that can stiffen a defense or shatter an offensive. Inside Vienna, Count Starhemberg's leadership was less about brilliant tactics and more about sustaining hope amid starvation and constant bombardment. His presence on the walls, even while wounded, was a powerful symbol of resilience. For the Ottomans, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa's failure was ultimately a failure of perception and adaptation. He misread the morale of his own troops, overestimating their endurance after a long siege, and he fatally misjudged the resolve and speed of the relief army. He became fixed on a single plan, the patient siege, and could not pivot when a new, dynamic threat emerged. This rigidity in the face of changing circumstances is a classic leadership trap, one that can afflict any executive, politician, or individual clinging to a strategy that the situation has already rendered obsolete. Sobieski's masterstroke was his understanding of timing. He held his most powerful weapon, the cavalry, in reserve until the precise moment when the Ottoman army was fully engaged and exhausted. He allowed the battle to develop, waiting for the enemy to commit before unleashing his decisive blow. This patience and sense of rhythm is what separates mere action from effective execution. In our own lives, whether negotiating a deal or pursuing a personal goal, recognizing the moment to apply maximum effort, the moment when conditions are most favorable, is a skill that turns effort into impact. The siege teaches us that victory often goes not to the strongest, but to the leader who best understands the landscape, unites their team, maintains their spirit, and knows exactly when to strike. These are not just military concepts, they are the fundamental components of navigating any great challenge, making a distant September afternoon suddenly feel remarkably relevant to the decisions we all must face. The trauma of the siege left an indelible mark on the city's very stones, a wound that demanded more than simple repair. In the decades that followed, the people of Vienna made a profound decision. They would not just rebuild their walls, they would reimagine their entire city. The old medieval fortifications, which had so nearly failed them, were seen not as a symbol of security, but of a terrifying vulnerability. One by one, those battered stone ramparts were systematically torn down. In their place, engineers constructed a new, state-of-the-art defensive system, a vast star-shaped complex of low-sloped, earthen bastions designed to absorb the impact of modern cannon fire. This was not a nostalgic restoration. It was a declaration that Vienna would learn from its past and meet the future on stronger, smarter terms. This new defensive ring created an immense no-man's land around the city, a cleared space that would, centuries later, become the canvas for one of the world's most beautiful boulevards, the Ringstrasse. The city's physical transformation was a direct and deliberate response to the siege, a literal breaking down of the old to make way for something more resilient and ultimately more open. This architectural confidence blossomed into a cultural golden age. With the existential threat from the east finally receding, a wave of relief and triumphant energy swept through Vienna. The city, once a fortress on the frontier, now embraced its role as the glittering heart of a vast empire. This newfound security and wealth attracted composers, artists, and thinkers from across Europe, fueling an unparalleled creative explosion. Grand Baroque palaces rose, their opulent halls soon filled with the music of Mozart, Haydn, and later Beethoven, sounds that defined an era. But perhaps the most delicious and direct link to 1683 was found not in a concert hall, but in a simple cup. Remember those strange dark beans found in the Ottoman camp? They were not just plunder, they were the seeds of a social revolution. Enterprising locals began roasting and brewing them, opening establishments that served this novel drink, coffee. The Viennese coffee house was born. These were not mere cafes, they were institutions, living rooms for the public where people from all walks of life could gather to read newspapers, debate ideas, play chess, and of course, talk. The coffee house became the engine of Viennese intellectual and social life, a cradle for philosophers and a stage for political discussion. It is a remarkable legacy, a cornerstone of the city's identity that literally grew from the abandoned supplies of its besiegers. How does a city move from a prolonged nightmare to a celebrated capital of music and ideas? The siege, for all its hardship, forged a powerful collective identity, a shared story of survival that became a bedrock of civic pride. The victory did not just keep the Ottomans out, it unlocked a torrent of creative and intellectual energy that had been pent up by centuries of fear. The city's leaders consciously channeled resources into magnificent projects, using art and architecture to proclaim a new, confident era. This transformation shows us that history's darkest moments can sometimes create the conditions for a renaissance. The vibrant, cultured Vienna we know today, with its grand opera and its cozy coffee houses, is not a separate story from the siege. It is the long, beautiful echo of its resolution. The city did not forget its trauma. It metabolized it, using the experience to build something more open, more creative, and enduringly magnificent. The landscape outside Vienna held its breath, no longer to the rhythm of cannon fire, but to the quiet work of remembrance. As the dust settled in September 1683, more than just a battle had been won, a defining narrative was born. It is a story of rescue, of a dramatic reversal, and of a resilience that echoed far beyond the city walls. We have journeyed from the ambition in the Ottoman War tents to the patient formation of the Polish cavalry lines, from the desperate, crumbling defense within the city to the earth-shaking momentum of the final charge. Historians will always thoughtfully debate whether a single clash can truly save an entire continent, a phrase heavy with meaning. Yet there is no scholarly debate about the monumental shift that followed. The relief of Vienna marked the definitive end of Ottoman expansion into the heart of Europe. It ignited a slow but unstoppable rollback of their frontier, a process cemented years later at the negotiating table of Karlowitz. For the Habsburg monarchy, it was not a rescue but a rebirth, a surge of power and confidence that transformed a vulnerable eastern outpost into the glorious capital of a vast, enduring empire. This pivot point stands as a powerful reminder of how fragile our cultural and political landscapes can be. They are not permanent features, but delicate arrangements that can hinge on the courage of individuals, the decisions made in command tents, and sometimes the sheer, breathtaking momentum of a single afternoon. The distant echo of that charge across the plain is more than just a thrilling tale. It is a lesson in possibility. It reminds us that history is not a predetermined path, but a story shaped in moments of extraordinary pressure, where the course of events bends under the weight of human action. If you found this journey to one of history's great crossroads compelling, please subscribe for more explorations into the moments that shaped our world. I would love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Do you believe a single battle can truly alter the destiny of a continent, or is it the currents that flow from it that truly carve the future?